Welcome to today's event, The Fight to Take Back Our Planet, with Professor Michael Mann, based on his recent book, The New Climate War. We are absolutely delighted to bring you this program today and to be partnering with our friends at Penn's Earth and Environmental Sciences Department. Michael Mann is Distinguished Professor of Atmospheric Science at Penn State, with joint appointments in the Department of Geosciences and the Earth and Environmental Systems Institute. He has received many honors and awards, including NOAA's Outstanding Publication Award in 2002 and selection by Scientific American as one of the 50 leading visionaries in science and technology in 2002. Additionally, he contributed with other IPCC authors to the award of the 2007 Nobel Peace Prize. More recently, he received the Award for Public Engagement with Science from the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2018 and the Climate Communication Prize from the American Geophysical Union, also in 2018. In 2019, he received the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement, and 2020, he was elected to the United States National Academy of Sciences. He's the author of many books in addition to the New Climate War. They include Dire Predictions, Understanding Climate Change, The Hockey Stick in the Climate Wars, Dispatches from the Front Lines, The Madhouse Effect, How Climate Change Denial is Threatening Our Planet, Destroying Our Politics, and Driving Us Crazy. He lives not far from Philadelphia in State College, Pennsylvania. And so I would like to welcome Professor Mann to Perry Worldhouse today virtually. And thank you for taking the time for you to be here with us today. I want to open by just offering Professor Mann the floor to tell us a little bit about his new book.
Thanks so much, Michael. Thanks for the kind introduction. And thanks to you and Perry Worldhouse and Penn for sponsoring this event. It's really a delight to be part of it. Indeed, I'm not that far from Philadelphia, but Philadelphia was actually a second home when I was growing up. My grandfather, my father, and his brother all went to Penn for their degrees. And so there's a familial connection there. I'm sorry I can't be there physically, but I hope to be able to do that sometime soon. So I am going to talk a little bit about my book. It's my only visual here today is going to be the book, The New Climate War. And why I decided to write this book. We are so close to now seeing the action that so many have worked so hard to achieve for decades, meaningful action on climate. And yet there still are some obstacles that lie in our way. They aren't sort of the old obstacles. The old climate war, as it were, was this effort by fossil fuel interests and those promoting their agenda, conservative media outlets, politicians, doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry by attempting to undermine public understanding of the science. Efforts to discredit the science, often by discrediting the scientists themselves. And I found myself at the center of those attacks more than 2 decades ago when my colleagues and I published the now famous hockey stick curve in the late 1990s. The hockey stick sort of laid bare the reality of climate change. And as such, it was it was inconvenient to the forces of inaction, or the inactivists, as I call them in the book. And for decades, there was this assault on the science, on the scientists, in an effort, once again, to undermine public understanding, to prevent politicians from doing anything about the problem, passing policies to help decarbonize our civilization. Well, now, decades later, we can see the impacts of climate change playing out in real time. They're no longer subtle. They're impacting us in our daily lives in the form of unprecedented extreme weather events, heat waves, wildfires, floods, droughts, superstorms. Climate change is no longer theoretical. We're seeing the detrimental impacts now in real time. And because of that, the forces of inaction can no longer claim that climate change isn't happening. They can no longer claim there isn't a problem, but they haven't given up either. Fossil fuel companies still have billions of dollars, trillions of dollars, in fact, of buried assets, fossil fuels that have not yet been extracted and sold. And they want to delay this transition from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. If they can't stop it outright, they'll at least do everything they can to delay it. And so they haven't given up, even though we've seen this sort of climate change denialism on the wane. We see these new, more insidious tactics. Other efforts to deflect attention away from the need for systemic solutions for policies by making it about, entirely about individual lifestyle choices and behavior, or promoting false solutions like carbon capture or geoengineering or natural gas, as if a fossil fuel can be the bridge to a fossil fuel-free future. And so there still is this effort to use these other tactics. They include doomism, despair mongering. Ironically, if we are led to believe that it's too late to do anything about the problem, it potentially leads us down that same path of inaction as outright denial. So these are the tactics that are being used by the forces of inaction to, at the very least, slow down this necessary transition off fossil fuels. And the problem is we don't have that time. We need to bring our carbon emissions down globally by a factor of 2 within the next decade if we are to remain on a path keeping planetary warming below 3 degrees Fahrenheit, where we really start to see the worst impacts of climate change. So there is great urgency, but there is also agency. And this is one of the points I tried to drive home in the book. There is still time to solve this problem. And so that's really the message of the new climate war. We have to recognize these new, often more subtle, insidious tactics that are, that comprise the obstacles that are still in our way. We're so close now, we can almost taste it. We can almost smell it. We can't allow these obstacles to prevent us from taking the necessary actions. And I have to say, I'm very encouraged by the shift in political winds here in the United States. A number of things have come together, and we can get into this in the conversation, that have led to this moment being perhaps the most opportune moment we have had in decades to finally see the action that is necessary. And so I'm looking forward to talking about all of that today in this conversation.
And so am I. And I also wanted to say, of course, I have always noticed that you've had what I thought might be a Philadelphia accent. And so now I know. Now I know what the story is behind that. So I actually wanted to kind of walk through some of the kind of main chunks of the book with you. But in order to kind of sort of set the stage and do that, I mean, you mentioned it just now. You have this wonderful framing in the book, which I really like, that we should have feel urgency, but also believe we have agency. And I want to talk kind of about the book, which is, sort of in some ways responding all the different forces of inaction. But just as a kind of background, what do we need to do? I mean, you said we need to keep the global mean temperature well below 2 degrees. And you said we already know how to do that. We don't need fancy new technologies. We don't need just 100% individual lifestyles. What needs to happen in the next decade or two? Are you still with us, Mike?
Yeah, I am. It froze up on me. Sorry about that.
No worries. I was just saying, what needs to happen in the next week or in the next decade or two in order for us to hit that goal?
Yeah, so thanks. So, indeed, we don't need a miracle. This is something that Bill Gates infamously said some years ago. We need a miracle to solve this problem. And it did rub some of us the wrong way, because we know what the solution is. We have the technologies necessary to decarbonize human civilization, renewable energy, and carbon-friendly practices that we can implement now. We can get to where we need to go based on current technology by changing the incentive structure so that we accelerate this transition that's already underway. And there is another book on climate change that's out right now by Bill Gates, where he does in fact promote what I've argued is sort of an overly technocratic solution. He sort of downplays the role that renewable energy can play. And in so doing, if you downplay, if you dismiss the role that renewable energy can play, it forces you then to articulate the case for potentially riskier options. And we could get into that. He's very bullish, for example, on nuclear energy. I'm, less convinced that it's a safe and sensible path forward to rely on increased nuclear energy. He also argues for geoengineering, manipulating the planetary environment in some other way to try to offset the warming of the planet. And so I think that that's not the right prescription. I think the right prescription is investing in the massive scaling up of existing technologies. We can do it. Mark Jacobson of Stanford in the peer-reviewed literature has sort of shown the path forward. Other colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, there are now multiple peer-reviewed studies that demonstrate that we can decarbonize human civilization by scaling up existing technology, meeting 80% of projected energy demand by 2035 and 100% by 2050 from renewable energy alone. Mm-hmm. There is the danger in what's sometimes called there is the danger that holding out the hope that we can solve this problem through technology that's 5 or 10 years down the road. Look, 10 years from now, we will be able to engage in massive geoengineering efforts to address the problem. There is this danger that by relying on as yet either non-existing or not demonstrable at scale technology that provides a crutch, that provides an excuse for us not doing the necessary work now of transitioning fossil fuels. And so we can do it. We have the technology. What we need is the political will. Okay. And just to get back to Bill Gates, in a recent interview, he said, I don't know what the solution is to the politics here. Well, sorry, Bill Gates, if you don't know what the solution is to the politics, you don't know the solution. Because at this point, it is a political challenge. It's not a technological challenge. Sure, there's new technology that we will undoubtedly develop, and there will be new economies of scale, and we will develop more and more efficient means of renewable energy. But we can solve the problem with existing technology alone. And the reason we haven't seen the action necessary is because of the politics. And so it's not a technological problem. It's a political problem, a socio-political problem at this point, and the solution is a socio-political one.
Okay, so, but I mean, it sounds like you're saying the deep decarbonization leading via renewable energy and things and other things following behind that. Something like that would be, if Mike Mann was in charge and could set the politics aside, that would be where you'd want to focus, at least domestically, on energy generation itself.
Indeed, and if I was in charge, if I was the climate czar, if I was, John Kerry or
Gina McCarthy.
Gina McCarthy, thank you. Who's the domestic sort of czar, and John Kerry, the international. They're sort of a team. If I were in charge, I'd be doing pretty much what the two of them are doing right now. I'm very heartened by what I'm seeing in the first 100 days from the Biden administration, this sort of cross-government, all-agency approach to attacking the climate crisis, addressing the intersectional issues of racial and climate justice. I think even, some of Biden's, strongest supporters have genuinely been surprised at just how bold an agenda they have put forward on climate. And so, yeah, I would be doing pretty much the things that they're doing, obviously working with Congress to see if we can get some climate legislation that'll complement executive actions, because you can't do everything by executive actions alone.
All right. Well, I wanted to, for those that haven't read your book, you look to three kinds of personality types that are some obstacle or public personas that are obstacles to climate action. One are the derivative of the kind of climate deniers, which are now people that promote climate inaction. The second are the doomists, who say that we what can we do? We're all doomed. And then the third are these kind of more techno fantastical solutions. So I thought we could kind of talk about each in turn. You give a really nice history in your book about the history of climate denial, how it moved from It's, as you point out, and as your colleagues like Naomi Oreskes have pointed out, it's literally the same people that worked on tobacco doesn't cause cancer, or smoking doesn't cause cancer, then worked on climate and were very, 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 very clever about how they did it. They didn't deny it outright. They tried to deny the certainty, and they've moved to this more insidious type of denial now. Maybe you could just say a little bit about, you mentioned it in your opening remarks, but exactly what are some of their greatest hits, the kinds of things that we should be on the guard for as we hear about this in public discourse.
Yeah, thanks. And so there's an alliteration that I use at one point in the book. We've gone from denial to sort of hard denial to soft denial, and delay and distraction and deflection, defeatism, doomism. These are the tactics that are being used now. And and we can certainly unpack that over the course of this conversation. As I said before, if we come to believe that it's too late to do anything, that we don't have any agency, then it potentially leads us down that same path of inaction. And the forces of inaction, the inactivists, they don't care about the path you take. They just care about the destination. They want you disengaged, and they don't care whether it's because you think we don't have a problem, or it's too late to solve the problem, or that we have other solutions, techno fixes that we can deploy. And one of the ways that they have gone about that is by, I talk quite a bit about deflection, deflecting attention away from the need for systemic solutions to individual behavior, as if it's just lifestyle. And that accomplishes three things. First of all, it takes the pressure off of policymakers to pass policies to incentivize the decarbonization of our civilization. If we make it all about it's just you and me decreasing our personal carbon footprint. Look, it isn't a coincidence that British Petroleum in the early 2000s gave us the first carbon footprint calculator, because British Petroleum and fossil fuel companies don't want us looking at their carbon footprint. They want us looking at our own carbon footprint. But what that does, it also leads to infighting, because there's really nothing more personal, really, than your lifestyle choices. And if they can get us finger pointing at each other and carbon shaming, why aren't you a vegan? Why do you still fly? If they can get us arguing and finger pointing at each other, it's a great way to divide the community of climate advocates. It's sort of a divide and conquer sort of tactic. And moreover, it's a great way of discrediting key thought leaders in the climate space. If you can tar Al Gore and Leo DiCaprio and John Kerry as these jet-setting hedonists, it's a way to try to discredit the message that they're carrying, which is not that we all have to live off the grid in a shack. It's that we have to change the incentives in our economy so that we move away from our reliance on fossil fuels towards.
So if I can just explore this point with you a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, you yourself in the book, you talk about how this is a subtle issue because we're both vegetarians. We both drive low emissions cars. I mean, when I say you, I mean you and me, both Michaels. And we want people to do these things, and we don't want. So it's a very it's a subtle point you make, which is that we can't let the fossil fuel interests cause us to point fingers, and we should the most important thing are policies. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't have personal responsibility. So I wondered, I mean, how do you think about that as a professor, as a father?
Yeah. So it's such a great point, and thanks for raising it. We should all do these things, right? There are all these things that we can do in our everyday lives that decrease our environmental footprint and our carbon footprint, and they save us money. They make us healthier. They make us feel better about ourselves. They set a good example for other people. My daughter, actually, when she was about 10 years old, decided that she would no longer eat meat. And I sort of, in sympathy with her, made the same choice. And it wasn't actually so much about climate. It was really just more about the ethical considerations. And so I don't eat meat, and I get my electricity from renewable energy. We have a wind-based power plan. We charge our plug-in electric vehicle off of our electricity that comes from wind. And so our local transportation is through renewables as well. We do all these things. I feel great that I do them, but I think it's counteractive to the progress we want to see if we start, shaming people over, rather than providing positive incentives, simply shaming them and telling them they're bad people. And there's a lot of social science research that suggests that if you do that, there can be sort of this rebound effect where people become even more ingrained in their behavior because they feel like they're under assault. So we have to be really careful about that. So there is this fine line. We should all do these things. We should all set an example for other people and provide incentives for everybody to move into that direction. And that's what, pricing carbon, providing subsidies for renewables, that's about providing incentives so that even the people who don't care or think about this problem are still part of the solution because the incentives are there. In the social science research, and that's now I'm leaving my domain of expertise and more into yours, but I do try to keep up on the literature. And there is a nuanced sort of picture that emerges because there are studies in the sort of marketing field that suggest that if people start down a path of engagement, it can lead them to greater and greater engagement. So if you start changing those light bulbs and buy more energy efficient appliances and start taking public transportation, you start with those little things, it leads you to even greater engagement. And so it can help you down that road of ultimately of being part of the larger sort of collective action that's required to see the policy changes we need. Mm-hmm. There's also some social science research, though, that suggests there can be sort of an emotional crowding out effect, where if you already feel like you're doing quite a bit in your individual life, you're doing all those things that you're told will decrease your carbon footprint, then it can actually lead to you being less supportive of policy changes. Like, why should I pay a carbon tax? I'm already doing all these other things. And so we just have to be really careful. We need both. We need individual effort. And what is collective action, but what is a collective but a collection of individuals? So obviously individuals play a really important part in collective action, in voting, in holding our policymakers accountable, in voting in climate advocates and voting out climate deniers. Because look, you or I, we can't put a price on carbon. We can't provide subsidies for renewable energy. We can't block additional fossil fuel infrastructure. Only our policymakers can do that. And so we have to make sure that they're accountable to us.
Totally. And I mean, as you know well, in terms of global policy, the logic of the Paris Agreement is transparency, basically. Like, that's the thing that's required. And so it's to try to, help us hold each other accountable, because with international instruments like this, it's hard to go far beyond it. We already are getting lots of great questions from the audience, so I wanted to move to these other sort of big stages of the book. So the doomists, the climate doomists. Yeah. Obviously some of it is what you say, that it's the forces of darkness wanting us to feel powerless. Although there are people, I think, who are, they're clearly not in the pay of the forces of darkness, and they just look at the situation and it just seems bleak. And I know that this is where the agency part of the urgency and agency comes in. I wonder what you could tell us about that. I mean,
yeah.
Other than read your book, but.
No, thanks so much, Michael, because that is such an important point as well. All of these, issues are far more nuanced than a single talking point can ever do justice to. And so you do need to sort of unpack them and look at the complexities. There are a lot of really good people, good-hearted people who want to think of themselves as doing the right thing and being part of the solution, who in a sense are sort of victims of that framing, right? They're not the villain. These are good people who have become convinced that, it is too late, and that at this point it's all just about adaptation or living off. And there's a whole movement called deep adaptation There are people who are really hardcore believers that the end times in essence are here or are near, and there's nothing we can do about it. They've been led astray. And what's so unfortunate is that these are some of the folks who would be most likely to be on the front lines demanding policy action. And to the extent that they become disengaged, it's really it's really destructive to the larger effort, because look, the fossil fuel industry historically has done a really good job in sort of marshaling the political right for their agenda. How ironically tragic it would be if they were able to marshal some of the political left to weaponize them into unwittingly doing their agenda as well. And so people, there is a lot of bad stuff that's happening in the world. We're still dealing with, the pandemic, and we all at this point, I think, know people who have lost their lives to this pandemic. There are reasons to be distraught about much of the bad that we see in the world, and it's understandable how people can feel at times that they lack agency. This is just too big a problem to solve. Again, they're victims. We have to help them through that stage. It may be a necessary emotional stage for them to go through, this sense of despair and doomism. We just can't allow them to get stuck in that stage. If it's a transition on a way to engagement, then let's help them along that path. And so we do need to be very sympathetic to people who fall into despair. In general, they're not the bad guy. They're not the villains here. They're the victims.
In the book, when you talk about what you take to be the more serious versions of doomism, you connect this in part to people thinking about climate too much in terms of tipping points. So I wondered, this is something I actually, even though I too am an IPCC author, I don't fully understand that there, the both sides of this debate. I mean, something like Arctic methane release. It seems like if there were to be, I personally think that people are just ambiguous when they say tipping point between, positive feedback, some kind of discontinuous event, and so forth. But you definitely go very, very strongly on the offensive against the tipping point framing of climate change. And you think that gives a lot of power to doomism. I wonder if you could, I'd love to talk to you about this another time over a beer in incredible technical detail. But for this purpose, could you say something about that, what you think, the legitimate version of that is, and what you think is wrong with it?
Yeah, so no, there are legitimate tipping points to worry about. And we may be seeing some of them start to play out. There was a study just last week about the slowdown of the so-called conveyor belt ocean circulation pattern. Yep. It's something we've published on. The ice sheets are actually losing ice sooner than we expected, and that fresh water is going into the North Atlantic, capping the sinking motion that drives that ocean circulation pattern. And so it appears to be slowing down ahead of schedule. And so there are these potential tipping points, but I like to think of them more as mines on a minefield. There's no one tipping point. It isn't like we go off the climate cliff. The farther we go down onto this minefield, the more of those tipping point responses we potentially encounter. My main criticism of many of the doomist narratives is almost invariably they are premised on some bad science about one very specific supposed tipping point, which you alluded to, Arctic methane. This idea that we are already seeing massive release of Arctic methane into the atmosphere, very potent greenhouse gas methane, and it's unstoppable. And there's one protagonist in the doomist space who insists that all life, including us, on Earth will be extinguished within 10 years. I believe that was 5 years ago, so I guess it's 5 years from now. And so there's a lot of bad science that just isn't backed up by any actual evidence. If you look at methane concentrations, they are going up, not exponentially, and we can actually see where the methane's coming from through the isotopic signature of that methane. And we know it's not natural permafrost methane. It's actually fracking. It's actually natural gas extraction that's allowing fugitive methane to escape into the atmosphere. So what's so ironic there, if you're pointing to the increase in methane, it's not an argument against the inevitability of climate change. It's not a natural response. It's actually us. It's the same fossil fuel extraction that is behind the buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So
this is one of Pennsylvania's gifts to the world is fracking, right?
and it's a tough conversation here, right? Because it's an economic issue as well as a scientific issue, and that's a whole conversation right there. My fundamental position is that, once again, a fossil fuel can't be the bridge to a fossil fuel-free future. It can't be the solution to a problem created.
I think you call it the bridge to nowhere in your book. So
I do, because it's crowding out investment in better strategies. Again, Bill Gates talking about geoengineering and nuclear. Again, if we pursue that path, we're potentially crowding out investment in the true solution, in the safest solution, which is renewable energy. So yeah.
And I mean, on that, I mean, I know that that's the third part, but since that's coming up in the Q&A a lot, so I thought we could maybe just start to turn the way. As a start, actually, a former student wrote to me and sent a question that I wanted to actually open with, and that's he said, okay, he's also acknowledging that this is he read your book and it's a political problem, and he said, there's what's worrying him is that there have been these successful campaigns that are kind of environmental focused, but they focus on such small potatoes that doesn't that crowd out the interesting things. I think he mentioned the kind of some of the plastic reduction campaigns, like great that we're not having plastic straws, but if you got one bite at this apple, that would not be the one to start with, plastic straws. So do you worry that some of these campaigns that the kind of the big environmental NGOs get together and work on together, plastic bags, plastic straws, are actually taking some of the oxygen out of where the real action needs to happen?
I do worry about that a bit, and it does have to do a bit with this deflection, right? Getting us focused on these individual actions as if that's the solution to the systemic problem. And a very brief digression. I know I talk quite a bit about the famous Crying Indian commercial advertisement in the book. Those of us who sort of grew up in the 70s remember this commercial, this advertisement, public service announcement about a tearful Native American who actually was an Italian American, the actor who played him. So even that wasn't, there was subterfuge even at that level of the advertising campaign. But it was about how we need to clean up the bottles and cans. We need to clean up our countryside. And it felt very empowering to a whole generation of people, including myself. But it was actually a PR campaign hatched on Madison Avenue by Coca-Cola and the beverage industry to defeat the bottle bills. They didn't want bottle bills, a regulatory solution to this problem. So they instead spent millions of dollars on this massive deflection campaign to get us focused on our role as individuals. We don't need regulation. We don't need, as a result of that very successful deflection campaign, we have one of the other great global environmental crises today that we face, the global plastic pollution crisis. And so it's ironic that it actually intersects that, straws, switching from plastic straws, these are all things we're going to need to do. We're going to need a way to live more sustainably on this planet. And climate change is just one axis in this multi-dimensional problem, which is environmental sustainability. So the challenge is, yes, we need to focus on plastic pollution and air pollution and all of these other things at the same time. They're all crises. The climate crisis comes with some extra penalties, procrastination penalties. It requires especially rapid action if we are to avoid some of these dangerous tipping points. And so I would argue that we really do need to focus systemically on this problem at its core, which is our continued reliance on fossil fuels for energy. There are other things we need to do as well, but that is the one thing, if we had to focus most of our energy and effort on, it's that.
All right, so I want to ask you a pair of political questions that we got from the audience. One is very domestic focused, and it's sort of like, thinking 2022, 2024, you said really good things about what the Biden team is doing, on the domestic side, how to continue making this a winning political issue and maybe even, accelerating that. And then on the kind of on the global side, climate, many countries are not democracies, and some of them have very, they have very, very strong incentives to not decarbonize, like, Saudi Arabia, Russia, then countries that cut down trees like Brazil. So just wondered, how do you think about the politics both domestically and globally, in the next couple of election cycles, given that this is sort of, this decade is the really, really, really important one? You
Yeah,
can take
great
it,
question.
take those questions how you like them.
We could talk about those topics for an hour alone, obviously. But I'll try to keep my comments here brief. Domestically, look, we've got to get through the legislation that we can right now that'll complement the executive actions being taken by the Biden administration. And Biden, the Biden folks are working with congressional Democrats to try to get some sort of climate policy passed in this Congress. We've seen what a challenge that is. For example, with that stimulus bill where there wasn't a single Republican vote, that forces you to get things through reconciliation. And that can be a challenge when you have red state Democrats like Joe Manchin, who may or may not support very bold climate policy. So something like a Green New Deal, it's difficult to see that passing Congress within the next 2 years. It's difficult to, there are already 4 Democrats who voted against a sort of almost mock Green New Deal bill last year. And so that means we'll need some sort of compromise climate legislation. It probably won't be as expansive as sort of the current versions of the Green New Deal, but I think that we can get some stimulus and subsidies for renewables, which are really important, and maybe a price on carbon, which is something that some moderate conservatives are on board with. And I think it is one of the tools in the toolbox that we need to use. So that's what I see happening within the next 2 years. And who knows, 2 years from now, 4 years from now, we might have larger majorities in both the House and the Senate where we could pass more bold climate legislation. But we need to get what we can passed now because we can't wait to make progress here. Internationally, the single most important thing that Biden has done is on the international front by, saying to the world that we are back and the United States is once again willing to lead. I think that has sent a very important message to other intransigent actors. You allude to some of the other petrostates, the Saudi Arabias and Russias of the world. Australia, under Scott Morrison, has been somewhat of an intransigent actor. Ironically, Australia was the first country to actually have a price on carbon, a carbon tax, but the conservative government that came in got rid of it. Scott Morrison is the Liberals, that word actually is the Conservatives in Australia, and they are not supportive of substantial climate action. But with the US now reasserting its role in this conversation, you can already see at the very least, the messaging coming from Scott Morrison has changed. They at least want to look like they're doing something or sound like they're doing something. So internationally, I'm pretty optimistic that we're at the cusp of something significant. In April, we'll have this summit here in the United States hosted by Joe Biden to sort of get everyone on board so that hopefully by the time we get to Glasgow at the end of the year, we will really have some substantial ratcheting up of commitments from all the countries of the world. Because right now, if you go with just the current commitments under Paris, it only gets us less than halfway to the cuts that we need. We've got to go well beyond that. And I'm more optimistic now than ever that we can achieve that.
Well, it's great to hear that. I mean, and I have to say though, on the stuff I work on, which is more on the adaptation side in terms of the negotiations, that it's like, if we can't even get the lift in countries like the US, which are, this will make great jobs and do all kinds of things to stimulate our economy, then moving money around to help the developing world avoid the worst of the baked in effects of climate change seems remote. But yet we have to. This is the best thing we can do, is to keep at it. So I'm going to try to share your optimism here. I'm just moving on to some other questions. As I predicted, a couple of our of the audience members and me would like to know more about how you think. We know you're generally not in favor of geoengineering, but there's a couple of questions about either direct carbon capture as a way of addressing some of the already baked in problems of climate change. I'll note that for the audience that all of those scenarios consistent with 1.5 in the sixth assessment report involve some kind of negative emissions mid-century. So that could be done naturally, but most people assume that means something like direct air capture. And then another question asks about, like, don't we need to have a plan B? Even though we may want to not talk about it so much, not put it in books called The New Climate War, shouldn't we be kind of thinking about if things get really, really bad, we may need something like solar radiation management, which is, for the audience who doesn't follow this, basically it's blocking out the sun, simulating volcanoes going off to buy us some time. So I just wondered how you think about not geoengineering as any kind of frontline solution or primary solution, but as, either trying to help get us over some of the worst effects that we've already caused, or as the kind of Hail Mary if we need it. Not the Bill Gates version, but the the sensible version.
Yeah, no, it's a fair question, and these are complex issues, and there is nuance that is required as we think about these things. It doesn't sound like a bad idea to have sort of a stopgap solution out there, if we fail to get the carbon emissions reductions that we need to avert catastrophic warming. And the safest of those by far are those that come the closest to solving the problem at its source. So just taking the carbon back out of the atmosphere is relatively, inert compared to something like shooting sulfate particles into the stratosphere, which could come with all sorts of potential negative consequences, unintended consequences. So, solar radiation management is a genius marketing term because it makes it sound like, oh, we'll just turn the sun down a little bit. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about putting massive amounts of sulfur pollution into the stratosphere. And there could be all sorts of ramifications, not just from the atmospheric chemistry standpoint, but because the cooling effect isn't the mirror of the global warming from greenhouse gases. So you don't just offset the warming everywhere. Some regions could actually warm faster. Other regions could cool. You might slow down the global hydrological cycle, dry out the continents, all sorts of potential problems. So when it comes to geoengineering, I try to sort of, distinguish between those potentially more invasive, problematic approaches and things like direct air capture, where we're just trying to suck the CO2 back out of the atmosphere. We're fighting the laws of thermodynamics and economics in doing so. It's incredibly expensive. And there are some questions about if we hold that out, and this is the moral hazard that I was referring to earlier, if we hold that out like, look, in 10 years, we'll be able to scale this up and suck up a lot of that CO2. Trust us, that can be used and is being used as an excuse for not decarbonizing as quickly as we can right now. So I think that's the danger, that these potential solutions that haven't yet been demonstrated at scale are held out as sort of, are used as a crutch. For in some of the forces of inaction, Rex Tillerson, former CEO of ExxonMobil, very big on geoengineering because, as he sees it, and a lot of fossil fuel sees it, it's a ticket for them to pollute for longer. And so we just have to recognize how fraught the politics are, the sociopolitics of the issue, while also recognizing, as you allude to, that we may need to keep this in the hip pocket. I mean, let's not rule it out entirely. Let's continue to study it, and let's have this conversation, because this is a much more constructive conversation than is climate change a hoax? So at least we've moved on to the serious policy discussion, and that's good.
I certainly agree. I do. I mean, as you know, there are lots of people who would have us not even study these things, which is, I think, but we both are researchers, so that always seems to.
Studying them, we've actually learned some of the reasons not to do them.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah.
So another question, I think this comes from one of our graduate students. She asks, so many deep uncertainties remain about how the future will unfold. And, again, putting the politics aside, but how if we could do optimal policy, how would you think that policymakers should thinks about these uncertainties when making decisions related to climate change? So she says, how do you think about the predict and act approach as compared to the assess the risk of the policy approach? But however you want to take this, I think, thinking about risk, communicating risk. Yeah. I mean, as an IPCC scientist, this is so much of at the heart of what happens.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And, it has become much more, an important part of the policy conversation. Sort of thinking about risk and thinking about extreme events and, the implications of uncertainty, because it turns out, from, top economists who have really studied this problem closely will tell you that uncertainty doesn't have the implications the critics would like you to think it has, right? The forces of inaction would say, well, why should we be doing this? It's uncertain, and it'll destroy the economy. And when they say something like that, that is based on economic projections that are wrong and certainly as laden with assumptions as the physical science. So there's a certain irony when you hear, conservative politicians say something like, well, we shouldn't, there's too much uncertainty in the science. And by the way, if we do this, it's going to cost us 10,560. The reality is the cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of taking action. That's the first rule to keep in mind. And the second rule is that uncertainty actually makes that even more true, because the possibility of events that are worse than our current projections suggest, and that is sort of the history of the modeling. We've learned things like ice sheet collapse, the slowdown of the conveyor belt, the increase in the severity of extreme weather events. Many of these things are well beyond where we thought we would be at this point. And it's because as we learn more about the science, we become aware that the system's more dynamic than our models had envisioned in the past. And that means that things can happen faster and that they can happen with greater magnitude. So uncertainty is just the opposite of what the critics would like you to think. The possibility that those uncertainties will break against us, as they sort of have, is reason for even more urgent action. And so it is really important to look at those extreme events, to understand the deep uncertainties, and to understand the implications that they have for policy.
I'm curious, since you've been involved for decades in doing science or doing policy relevant science in this area, do you think that the scientific community has gotten much better at sharpening the way you talk about these kind of issues about uncertainty and projections for policymakers? I mean, I know that ultimately they want to know what's going to happen and how much is it going to cost. But yeah, I mean, and your tools have gotten better, but has the communication gotten better?
I think it has, and you're absolutely right. I mean, there's certainly far more sophistication in the climate research community in looking at these issues of deep uncertainty and quantifying risk and looking at the full probability distribution, not taking the average of the IPCC projections as gospel, but looking at the spread among the models and the full distribution. And the challenge from a communication standpoint, and the WeatherCom community has really struggled with this as well when it comes to, we used to call them natural hazards. Some of them are no longer natural. Some of the worst hurricane impacts we've seen are undoubtedly exacerbated by warming, by climate change. But how do we convey the risk of an approaching major hurricane when there's uncertainty in the trajectory and the intensification? And so some of the tools that have been developed when it comes to risk communication in that space have really informed the way we communicate risk to policymakers, where we understand, look, if we show them a complicated probability distribution function, they're not going to have any idea what to do with that. So we have to figure out, how do you translate that in common language to a policymaker? Well, this is what we think is most likely to happen, but there is a 1 in 3 chance that this could happen, and that's really bad, and we want to hedge against that as well. So I think we have become more sophisticated, in large part because of the interaction between the scientific community and people in the social sciences who have been working on these sorts of problems for a long time. There's a much more mature interdisciplinary approach to addressing these problems now.
Great, and we just put into the chat the IPCC special report on 1.5, which is I can't say friendly introduction to this, but it's a friendlier introduction if you want to see how this is being dealt with right now. So we've had a couple of questions that have to do with the parts of decarbonization that are not energy sector driven. So obviously, as you know, energy sector is only about a quarter of all of the greenhouse gas emission. What are your thoughts on the next decade for building materials or for food systems or all the other sorts of things? And I think this is particularly relevant to a Perry Worldhouse audience because globally, while of course there's plenty of electricity production, some parts of the world have a lot of building materials, a lot more than their actual electricity consumption. So
Yeah.
where should we be taking food and concrete and those kinds of things?
Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah, 2/3 of our carbon emissions are from the burning of fossil fuels, but when you sort of break that down, it's a third is electricity production. Then the next largest sector would be transportation, and there it's sort of obvious. Hey, if we can decarbonize the grid, and we can charge our vehicles off of a decarbonized grid, then we can decarbonize the transportation sector as well. But then you get to these sort of
Airplanes.
difficult to decarbonize sectors like air travel, right? And do we, and you have concrete production as well, where there's certain things that we rely upon where there isn't an obvious solution to eliminating those carbon emissions. Although if you talk to experts, there is a lot of study now about, sort of high density biofuels that we might be able to get away with for air travel. When it comes to concrete production, much more carbon friendly approaches to doing that, industrial processes. And here's the thing, if you look at like aviation, it's 3% of our global carbon emissions. Cement production, maybe it's also in the single digits. So if we decarbonize everything else, those difficult to decarbonize sectors would be sort of 10%. And that's down in the range where, uptake, be it artificial carbon uptake or reforestation, afforestation, where changes, that though it is at the level where we could offset that with uptake, carbon uptake. Agriculture, again, the same thing. Meat is obviously more carbon intensive than plants, so there are ways to decarbonize that sector. I think it's dangerous to take an authoritarian approach where you can't eat meat anymore. That is going to lead to widespread opposition. But what we can do is provide much carbon friendlier practices and incentives to get people to, hey, if you eat a steak once a year, make it a special event, and put more chicken in your diet. That's going to cut carbon emissions way down. If you go pescatarian, that's pretty soon it's diminishing returns. You're pretty close actually to like vegan or vegetarian if you have a little bit of meat in your diet. So there are ways for us to do all this, but there is no one magic bullet, as you allude to. We have to decarbonize every sector of civilization. That's why I like the current administration's approach, which is to incorporate carbon policy into every single government agency and everything we do, because it impacts everything we do and carbon comes from everything we do.
Mm-hmm. So as I said, again, this is, the Perry Worldhouse audience tends to be interested in global policy. So thinking about COP26 in Glasgow in only a few months, it's coming quickly.
Yeah.
For the inside baseball types, like a big win would be we finally get Article 6, worked out. But like really thinking about it in the kind of appropriate level of bigness of which it is. I mean, what you said you were really, impressed and kind of it's even better than you could have imagined with the Biden administration's plans. What would you imagine if the world came together in Glasgow in November and just like blew everyone away? What would that look like? Like, what should we be working for? We like to end on optimistic notes.
A boy can hope. Were that that the way it's likely to play out. No, I mean, there are intransigent actors who are going to go down kicking and screaming, and you sort of alluded early on to this question of enforcement mechanisms. And right now, the primary enforcement mechanism is peer pressure. It's name and shame, and that works with to some extent with good faith actors, but it's not so successful with bad actors. And so there's the carrot, but there's going to have to be a stick too. And that's I think that's what we have to figure out, how you can put teeth in an international agreement in the current geopolitical atmosphere that we have. We just have to, do what we can. We can get most of the way there by getting, the coalition of the willing on board. I refer to some of these others as the coalition of the unwilling, the Saudi Arabias and the Russias and the Brazils and currently Australia. If those are the only intransigent actors left and the rest of us implement the sorts of strategies that we're talking about, we'll get most of the way there. It's again, this idea of there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Let's go for that first while we bring the stragglers along and we figure out, how to dot the I's and cross the T's in our efforts.
And I guess, hope, at a certain point, there'll be no one to sell that fuel to and no one to sell the coal to. I mean, that would be good.
And one of the, let me just quickly get in, one of the sort of surprising heroes in all this is the finance community, the investment community, and they're playing a role. We're seeing, BlackRock, Bank of England, a lot of the largest investment funds that are starting to view, carbon intensive projects as risky, as bad investments from the standpoint of transition risk. If we decide that we can't burn any more fossil fuels, those are going to be really bad investments. We're going to have to leave their main assets in the ground, but also out of a sense of fiduciary responsibility. Mutual funds that are, fiduciary funds. Australia has a lot of the largest ones. I had a lot of interesting conversations with them when I was down there. They do recognize their role as making sure that they don't destroy the planet for their clients.
Well, there's so much more in the Q&A, and there's so many more things for us to discuss, but I'm afraid we're going to have to end this discussion, and I hope we can have you back in the fall to talk about COP26 as we get a little closer. But I want to really thank you so much, Professor Mann, for sharing these insights. I feel like I have, even though I read your book and the previous ones, I feel like I have a much more nuanced take on how you see these issues. And I want to thank the audience for joining us today for this edition of The World Today. We hope to see you next Tuesday for The World Today, when Professor Susan Weiss and Professor Frederick Bushman, who are both virologists here at Penn and they're co-founders of the Center for Research on Coronaviruses and Other Emerging Pathogens, and they'll speak about the next pandemic. And so we'll drop a link to register for that event in the chat. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on our YouTube channel, and you can always find out about all of our great events by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, not TikTok yet, but we're working on it. So we'll drop links to all of those things in the chat as well. But thank you all for being with us today. Thank you again, Mike. It's really been a great pleasure. Appreciate it very much. Thanks for fighting the good fight, and see all of you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.